A lot of people talk about the survivors of the Epstein class in sort of this like abstract way of being vulnerable, of being susceptible. A lot of press and a lot of time is given to these people's psychological backgrounds, their histories of abuse, as if that is somehow like, personally what made them more susceptible to Epstein or something. And I think for us, it's very clear that like there is a structural reason for that vulnerability.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. In the past few years, we've seen the fallout of one of the biggest scandals of the 21st century, Jeffrey Epstein's decades of systematic abuse and exploitation of women and children. And the scandal has been jaw-dropping, like truly depraved, in terms of its scale, and it has involved some of the richest and most powerful members of society, of the world, and the capitalist class. This includes people like Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Lord Mandelson. It includes mega wealthy capitalists like Bill Gates, Les Wexner. It even includes President Trump himself, and lots of other people who, even if they didn't directly participate in the abuse, they clearly looked the other way and they benefited from their associations with Jeffrey Epstein. But with the exception of Epstein himself and Ghislaine Maxwell, there hasn't been any accountability for these abuses, or for that matter, any accountability for anyone who is part of the so-called Epstein class. Like, yes, there has been the sort of drip-drop, gradual release of the Epstein files, despite the delays, the stonewalling from the Trump Department of Justice. Politicians, they sort of pay lip service to the need to investigate these crimes, but as I say this, I'm kind of well, do they? They kind of barely even pay lip service to that. But the political impact of the Epstein scandal has been shockingly small, despite its scope and despite the outrage from below, which interestingly comes from all parts of the political spectrum. So here's the central question that motivates this episode, which is, why is this? Why has decades-long abuse, aided, abetted, and covered up by the people at the very top of society, not led to an enormous reckoning, or at the very least, more than just 2 people being convicted and imprisoned? Maybe most simply, obviously, we could say that rich people are closing ranks to protect themselves, to hide each other's involvement in this. But what we're arguing today is that it's not that simple. And specifically what we're arguing is that Epstein's crimes would not have been possible without the exploitation enabled by capitalism. What I mean by this is that Epstein and his associates preyed on vulnerable girls and young women, which is how the media accurately describes the victims. But the reason they were vulnerable and targeted in the first place was because we live in a system where people need to sell their labor to make a living, where members of the capitalist class, like Epstein, can mask their abuse by providing a paycheck, providing housing, providing a visa, things like that. To be even more super concrete here, why is it that a 16-year-old girl, which by the way is how old Virginia Giuffre was when she met Ghislaine Maxwell, needs to work for someone like Epstein, needs to go to Jeffrey Epstein's island? In this sense, when we say that wealth and power enabled the abuse of these women and children, we don't just mean it in some abstract sense. We don't mean wealth automatically turns you evil. We're not just referring to the solidarity that rich people have, the fact that they have their own backs, the fact that they have Epstein's back, for example. What we mean is that the abuse was the result of the positions that Epstein and capitalists occupy in society, where they own and control people's means of survival. To quote my comrade Madeleine Freeman, who wrote an excellent article about this, and she is going to join me on today's episode to discuss this, quote, "There's no distinct Epstein class, no good capitalists and bad capitalists, but rather a single system built on exploitation and oppression," unquote. We'll really unpack this in today's episode, so please keep listening. But there's another reason why Epstein's abuse was possible, which is the decades-long process of containment and pacification of the liberal feminist movement. So think about this. Isn't it weird that despite the sort of contours of the scandal, the fact that it involved girls and women in particular who were targeted, it's never discussed as a feminist issue, right? Like, the liberal feminist movement hasn't been galvanized at all to demand accountability. The liberal feminist movement is not yelling about the Epstein scandal from the top of its lungs. Because how can it, right? Like, the horizon of liberal feminism is women's greater incorporation into the capitalist system, which, as I just argued, is the system that enables this kind of abuse. On top of that, the liberal feminist movement is entrenched in the institutions of the state and in the Democratic Party in particular. Like, the liberal feminist movement will obviously not throw Bill and Hillary Clinton under the bus. Me and Madeline explore these topics in much more depth in this episode. We also talk about the recent scandal surrounding Maine Senate candidate Graham Plattner and what that scandal reveals about the Democratic Party and the class reductionist elements of the left. Finally, we try to end it, of course, on a more hopeful note. What's the alternative? Well, we discuss the alternative to liberal feminism, which is socialist feminism. So, whereas liberal feminism takes for granted that we have to live in this system, this capitalist system, where a capitalist class at the top controls the means of survival, the working masses need to sell their labor to survive, a system which, I cannot stress this enough, enables the kinds of abuse perpetrated by Jeffrey Epstein. Socialist feminism says that we need to attack capitalism and patriarchy at the root. This doesn't mean that we're saying like a socialist society would automatically be some sort of like paradise, free of sexism and racism, free of other types of prejudice and bigotry, and, all societal ills would be cured. But it does mean that the kinds of structural conditions for these kinds of harms would be eliminated. And fighting these harms in the here and now, whether they stem from Epstein or from the unacceptable abusive behavior from Graham Plattner, must be part of the fight against capitalism. If you want to support Left Voice, you can do so at patreon.com/leftvoice. Visit our website, leftvoice.org. Make sure to follow us on social media, where we use the handle left_voice. And it would be super helpful if you left us a nice little review at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Wherever pods are cast, if you will. Here is my interview with Madeline. Maddie, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I think to a certain extent, people grasp that the Epstein affair is not just about one big, bad, evil person. Like, a big part of mainstream discourse is about Epstein's whole entourage, the entanglement of major political and business figures. And there's this idea that we would agree with that, rich people here, they are sticking together. Rich people are protecting their own. And it's true. But what we would argue, and what is kind of the underlying reason as to why we wanted to have this conversation, is that it is even deeper than this. So I want to dive right away into how capitalism and patriarchy facilitated Epstein's crimes, and how it's about the system itself. It's not about one evil person, but it's not even just about one uniquely evil group of people, like rich people like Donald Trump, Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, who naturally want to protect their own interests. I know I'm starting off here with kind of a very major question, but what role did class, capitalism, and patriarchy play in causing the situation? In other words, how did these things enable Jeffrey Epstein to target his victims?
I mean, I think you're right that there is a base level understanding that this is called one of the great global conspiracies of our time, right? And there's even a term for it, right? Which is like the Epstein class. And it's interesting because I think like on the left, there's even a fruitful debate about whether we should use Epstein class or not, right? And I think it depends on what we mean when we say the Epstein class. Because on the one hand, there is a group of people who are trying to do exactly as you said, to pin this on a very few people at the very, very top, a few people who it's not disputing power in itself, but the people who have it. It's not disputing these power structures, but the fact that a few bad eggs or bad eggs, bad apples have gotten to the top and are using their power for evil, for this kind of abuse, exploiting the system. And so it's as if there's a very special class of people who are perpetrating these crimes. But I think what we would say is that there is a class doing this. There is an Epstein class, but it's actually much bigger than just a few people at the top, right? Epstein's class is nothing other than the capitalist class. And what do we mean by that? Not just wealth in and of itself, not just politicians in and of themselves, but a class of people who own everything that we need to survive, essentially, and who have, commodified those things so that it's impossible to thrive and survive in capitalism. And so I think that that distinction is actually pretty important also to talk about, when we get to this point in the conversation, how we combat it. But just to like delve a little deeper into that idea of how capitalism and patriarchy are really at the center of this, I mean, putting to the side for 1 second that the Epstein files are like hardly ever considered as a feminist issue, right? But on the other hand, a lot of people talk about the survivors of the Epstein class in sort of this like abstract way of being vulnerable, of being susceptible. A lot of press and a lot of time is given to these people's psychological backgrounds, their histories of abuse, as if that is somehow like, personally what made them more susceptible to Epstein or something. And I think for us, it's very clear that like there is a structural reason for that vulnerability, right? And a structural reason for, the types of similar backgrounds among the people who Epstein targeted. And that's really important because, it's not just that these are people who, I mean, maybe in some cases who Maxwell and Epstein and his associates met just in passing, but in a lot of instances, it was people who were working and young girls who were in positions of having to work to make a living, to make it through school, who had, were in Epstein's orbit because they needed something, whether it was a job, a connection, or a visa. These are very basic needs that are not guaranteed in our society, and that a class of people, the capitalist class, control and their governments control. And those are the axes on which like Epstein and his associates orchestrated this abuse, right? It's very clearly a product of the people who own what we need in society controlling those who have to work, who have to buy and get what they need to survive, and who can't do that in a capitalist society. There's no investigation into why even women who are looking or young girls who are looking to get into schools, looking for opportunities, why as women in this society or as working people in this society, they don't have the same access to these things as other people.
Yeah, I think that's super important talking about the kind of structural reasons for the vulnerability, the structural reasons why Epstein could target them. I want to, and I don't know if this is super cringe for whoever interview, but I want to kind of read back to you a quote that really stood out to me from your article, which is that it's not wealth and power in the abstract that enabled the systemic and prolonged abuse of these women and children. It's the direct result of the positions that Epstein and the rich and powerful occupy in capitalist society, and as the people who own and control the means of survival. And one reason I really like this quote beyond, all the reasons you just gave about why this is so structural, why this is not just kind of like, oh, these, poor women, girls happen to just be targeted, is that I think it also gets to this point even broader that like, if we replace these people with nicer rich people or like less evil rich people, society would be magical. Like, it is not the fact that the Epstein class happens to be composed of a ton of really evil assholes, even though, of course, they all certainly are. But it really is this systemic layer that is not analyzed at all in any way in kind of the mainstream media, for example.
That's really important is that when there are a few people at the top like this, when society is not democratically run, when your survival depends on having to sell your labor power to survive, all the options for those of us at the bottom are much more limited, whereas the options, the way of living and their version of thriving for the capitalist class is sort of endless. I think Epstein really shows that, is that there's a set of laws for the people who set the laws, and then there's a whole different set of rules and standards and limitations for the people at the bottom. And that's not to say that it's just a matter of executing those laws better or anything like that, because, the whole other side of this is that we have the most powerful government of the richest country in the world really operating to not hold anyone accountable for the Epstein files. Like, again, it's always astounding to me. Like, it's only in the US, it's only Epstein and Maxwell who've been charged with anything related to these crimes, right? And instead, you have a government where literally the highest offices in the country are implicated in the files. Donald Trump is mentioned, what is it at this point, hundreds of thousands of times in the files, actually actively stepping in to preclude any type of real investigation. And really, we've seen, I think, over the last, I don't know, I mean, since Epstein was convicted and then died in 2019, we've really seen how both parties sort of just like throw the Epstein ball back and forth, because it is such a toxic brand. He was so embedded in the bipartisan regime. It's not just a question of Democrats and Republicans, it's a question of bourgeois society, bourgeois state itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, very telling also that Trump is never reluctant to attack Democrats and talk about, crooked Hillary and talk about the Clintons and stuff like that. But yeah, it's so interesting that the Republicans don't even go as far as to be like, well, look at Bill Clinton and Bill Gates. We really need to give them accountability here. Like, it really says a lot that, like, this is so toxic and so, implicates all sides of it that they simply cannot even, you know, bring justice or, keep other people accountable on the other side of the political aisle.
100%. I mean, the, so-called hearings for Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, I think Bill Gates even gave testimony. Like, it's just the most performative version of accountability, because nothing happened other than that they sort of gave themselves public cover for everything, and Bill Clinton was able to say, I'm being accountable. It's like, okay, but you very clearly were involved in this and very chummy with this person. So, like, again, it's not about Bill Clinton in and of himself, but a political class, not that it serves a particular class in society that can't hold itself accountable, because it really would be a house of cards all tumbling down, I think.
Understandably, we've talked a lot about the US bipartisan regime, and I think it kind of makes sense because, I mean, it is really incredible that the most powerful person in the world, Donald Trump, is implicated so heavily in it. Other kind of US based capitalists are implicated so heavily, like Bill Gates and even Elon Musk. But I do want to dig in just a little bit into the kind of international element here. And I was kind of reminded of this also when you mentioned visas for
Mhm.
the exploited girls as well and women as well. So I guess I'm curious about the international element, because part of the scope of his crimes doesn't just come from like Donald Trump's involvement, for example. It is, as you described earlier, the fact that he was ensnared with politicians, business elites, intellectuals kind of all over the world. I mean, like Prince Andrew, even people like that. What does this also reveal, this Epstein case, about the global nature of capitalism, exploitation, and oppression?
Yeah, it's true that and it's I would say probably no coincidence that it's only people and capitalist figures, politicians in other countries who've faced any sort of consequences. Like you mentioned, Prince Andrew. Oh gosh, what's his name? The prime minister in England who sold secrets to, not sold secrets, but exchanged secrets with Epstein for all sorts of favors,
Oh,
et cetera, et
Lord
cetera.
Mandelson?
Mandelson, yes,
Yes,
thank
that guy.
you.
Yeah,
Our
yeah.
UK expert. Thank you, Onan. These are the people who face some sort of public reckoning for this. But it's important to also highlight, though, that Prince Andrew, for example, has not been charged with anything. He's been stripped of titles, he's been removed from the public eye, but it's not as if he is facing real charges on the very well documented abuse that he participated in, right? But it's not just that. It's not just that there are people from other countries involved. It's that the way that, on the one hand, Epstein was able to amass his power, amass his wealth and influence was because of a global capitalist system, right? Like it goes, very quickly to his ties to Israel. Many of his business dealings, political links were very tied very heavily to Israel and its colonial and genocidal project in Palestine. I mean, the way that Epstein was embedded in defense spending for the IDF, it speaks for itself. But there are countless examples of this, of how these global capitalist networks of companies that do business all over the place, that are all enmeshed with each other, it also created the conditions for Epstein to operate in this way, right? Of doing favors for this person here, political, personal favors, engaging these people in what, his own social life and the abuse that he perpetrated. Like all of this contributed to a climate of capitalist solidarity in a way, right? Of something that kept all those things together. But I wanted to stop for a second on the immigration question, because I think that this actually shows in a lot of ways how capitalism, though, we know that patriarchy, we know that sexism and misogyny, like these things obviously existed before capitalism itself. There's nothing, particularly new about this kind of scandal like the Epstein scandal, but it does show in particular the way that capitalism has created new methods of oppression and new methods of exploitation. And I think immigration is a very good example. Is that even in cases where, I mean, most often these people were minors, but even in examples where they weren't, a lot of these people who were targeted by Epstein and his accomplices were immigrant women. I mean, the most famous example, or most publicized example, is that of Brazil and the modeling agent who really served as a direct line, a direct sex trafficking line. Like, that's what it is, from Brazil to the U.S. Enabled Epstein to target immigrant women who needed a visa, who were, promised a job and economic stability in exchange for basically subject to Epstein and his every whim, and those are his inner circles, and all of the, abuses suffered on, the infamous plane, all of this, right? And it's not just that, it was easier to do these dealings in faraway countries, but very materially the promise of stability and a visa, and nothing other than these people, Epstein, but all people who worked for him, were close to him, controlling quite literally these people's movements, these young women and girls, their movements, controlling their visas. I mean, there's countless reports of people being like, well, I didn't have access to my documents, so I couldn't leave. I couldn't leave Epstein's Islands. I couldn't leave, his apartment. Everything was tied to staying with Epstein himself. And that's really important, because that's a product of our modern immigration system, and also the question of imperialism, right? Because it's no coincidence that these people are coming from countries that have been ravaged by decades of imperialist oppression and exploitation by the United States, right? In that sense, of course, Epstein is a US citizen, a part of the US capitalist class, because you look at a country like Brazil, these are people who are fleeing economic conditions that are in many ways shaped by the level of economic, military, and political power that the US has. And who is it but the US that's dictating these people's movements and all of that, by forcing them to go through all these channels for them to depend on someone like Epstein to come to the US and to make a living, to send money back to their families and all of that. So, we really see how capitalism as a system and modern immigration, which globalized the working class, right? But essentially it's also created a workforce that is international. And we can talk more about that later. That's also our power, right? As an international working class. But on the other hand, it's also created new methods of exploitation, which is, I think, something we see very clearly in the case of Epstein.
I want to move on to the reaction to the Epstein affair, specifically how the feminist movement, the liberal feminist movement, has reacted to it. Because, as you said at the start of this conversation, interestingly, the Epstein case is actually not viewed through the lens of feminism. It's not viewed as like a feminist issue. In your article, you write about how the Epstein affair, especially, quote, underscores the inability of liberal feminism to effectively combat systemic gender violence and oppression, hindering its ability to protect, let alone expand, the rights of women. I want to unpack this. How did the liberal feminist movement react to the Epstein revelations? And how do their reactions reveal their failures and, more broadly, what liberal feminism has to offer?
Yeah, I mean, everyone around me and myself included were just like, why is no one doing anything? Why are we not burning it all down? Like, it was really, yeah, very frustrating and very, I don't know, just infuriating, to see the sort of lack of reaction from the top or in any sort of real organized way. And you have to look around, and I'm like, well, where is the feminist movement? I mean, I very much was politicized around Kavanaugh's appointment in, what was it, 2018? And I remember then, like, storming Grand Central when that was going on. And of course, like coming up, I was in college when the Women's March was there, millions of people protesting the fact that someone who bragged about grabbing women by the pussy was suddenly skyrocketed to the presidency, right? Like, it's really been, I don't know, very baffling the lack of response. And it's not to target any single person saying that they're not outraged or they're not doing something. In terms of a centralized response, we haven't really seen that. And it's also shouldn't come as a surprise because we also didn't see that when the Dobbs decision came down, when Roe was overturned. And so again and again, I feel like people around me are like, where is the feminist movement? Where is a movement that's going to fight against this stuff? Is it just that, like, well, Trump is president now, Trump became president again, and so we just gave up? And that's, I think, the conclusion that a lot of people are coming to. But I think instead it's actually a much longer process of demobilizing the feminist movement that has everything to do with its ties to the Democratic Party as a party that we say time and time again is the graveyard of social movements, right? Where this very progressive energy is mobilized and then subsequently demobilized, and every attempt is made to direct that energy to the polls. There has been no organized response from, if we say that liberal feminism, because we live, in a capitalist society, if we say that liberal feminism is still the dominant force within the feminist movement, what has the reaction been? Like, not even enough op-eds, Odin. Not even enough anger of how this could
Totally.
happen, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and kind of connecting it to what you were talking about earlier as well. I mean, liberal feminism is not about dismantling capitalism. I mean, liberal feminism has this vision that women's liberation means women being incorporated into the capitalist system. So if we argue, as I think is sort of like the underlying argument here behind everything we're talking about today, that this whole situation with Epstein was enabled by the capitalist system, it simply is not possible for a liberal feminist movement operating under this logic to meaningfully oppose the Epstein situation or to meaningfully, bring justice for people who were exploited by Epstein.
Yeah, exactly. I think we can take it a step further and say that, like, liberal feminism is implicated in the Epstein files. And the perfect example of that is Hillary Clinton. I mean, let's say it. Like, Bill Clinton is was very clearly part of Epstein's inner circle. There's pictures of Hillary Clinton with Epstein, and does that mean that she was that's not the question, whether she was actively participating or not, but you have the person who was supposed to end all sexism by becoming the president of the United States, very close to one of the greatest examples of how capitalism perpetuates this type of exploitation, right? And so it really becomes increasingly discordant to say that we will eliminate sexism by having more women at the top, when women at the top have also participated in these crimes and then continued exploitation of working class women and poor women, immigrant women. That is precisely probably part of the absence of any kind of organized response, is that, liberal feminism actually created the conditions for this to be possible in a lot of ways. And in what sense? Because, as you said, this is not a matter of ensuring that every person has what they need to survive, that they're not as vulnerable to gender oppression, to racism, to, these ways that capitalism exploits us in all different ways, oppresses us. It's not the question of creating a society where the conditions for that kind of abuse is not possible, but, as you said, further integration into that system. Liberal feminism, the horizon that it set for us of equality within the capitalist system, of more women breaking the glass ceiling to supposedly pave the way for those below, without acknowledging the fact that getting up there requires exploiting those very people, those very people you're hoping to pave the way for, that it means profiting off of and propping up a system that exploits people in other countries to make money for you to be able to ascend the capitalist ladder. Liberal feminism sets our horizon on a promise that it can't deliver on. And I think we've seen that very clearly, particularly after 2008, is that this utopia of financial stability, even as a base level, of ascending the corporate ladder and becoming a full person through your work, those things have not happened. In fact, we're going in the opposite direction. In fact, we have less rights than in the heyday of progressive neoliberalism, of liberal feminism, of this, we have no longer is abortion a guarantee. I mean, it never really was, let's be honest, but that right was rolled back at the federal level. More and more people are living paycheck to paycheck, not to mention the fact that women, particularly after the pandemic, left the workforce in droves and haven't come back because they're realizing that childcare is more expensive than living off of one income, among many other reasons. And so I think that that's something that the Epstein files has put in very stark relief, is that liberal feminism doesn't really have an answer for the type of oppression that it promised to combat. It doesn't really have an answer for people who struggle under the yoke of gender oppression, racism, all these things. It doesn't have that kind of liberatory perspective.
I'll come back to feminism in just a moment, specifically what we see a socialist feminism would look like and how they would tackle the situation, how they would react to this. But I want to pivot a little bit because as we record this, we are in the middle of the fallout of another very explosive scandal, which is the sexual assault revelations against Graham Plattner, who dropped out of the main Senate race as a result of these revelations. Obviously, I don't want to just pin it on these revelations because this came after other, shall we say, red flags emerged, most notably his Nazi-related tattoo that he had for years, but also other kind of problematic relationships with women. The Plattner situation here obviously is very different. The scope is completely different. He is not Jeffrey Epstein at all. So I don't want to draw a one-to-one parallel between him and the Epstein situation. But the reason I bring him up in this context, particularly after hearing about, as you just described, the failures of liberal feminism, is that similarly, the feminism movement has not come out against Plattner. There are many leftists who, even after these very serious allegations, argue that, okay, well, we need to hold our noses and vote for Plattner because, well, at least he holds progressive positions. So in the grand sort of pro-con list of political positions, Plattner still comes up on top. So I kind of want to dissect this a little bit and see if we can draw some connections here. And I'm wondering about, what does the Plattner situation reveal about liberal feminism? Or, I mean, even more broadly, like what does this reveal about the Democratic Party's relationship to feminism?
Yeah, as you said, how surprised we are that this is how Plattner's campaign ended. But yeah, on the one hand, I feel like there's more accountability, right? In a sense, for the allegations against Plattner, much more so than Donald Trump, for example, right? And so on the one hand, like, I think that the reaction from people who were supporting Plattner, from the people who were canvassing for him, who were energized by his campaign, and the utter betrayal that a lot of people feel is very understandable, justify all of that, right? And so on the one hand, I think that, his stepping down is reflective of that, of a base of people that are not going to take these kinds of allegations lightly, who want fighters for the working class, who actually fight for the working class, which includes fighting against oppression, which includes holding themselves to a standard of, not actively harming other people, of taking accountability for their previous problematic or even harmful, bigoted, racist, etc., like views or statements. And so on the one hand, like, I think the reaction from below has been very understandable. But there's another part of this, which is that I'm not sure that this was the thing that really sealed Plattner's coffin, right? Because what we saw is that the establishment of the Democratic Party was gunning for Plattner from the beginning. And this is not to justify absolutely anything, right? We knew who Plattner was as a candidate. And as you said before, tons of people on the left supported him even then, including Bernie Sanders, who said, focus on his policies. There's lots of flawed people on Capitol Hill. It's like, well, maybe we don't want to elect another one, but okay.
Yeah, exactly.
But other than that, the establishment of the Democratic Party has been threatened by a campaign like Plattner's, because they're threatened by a progressive wing that they can't control. And that was part of Plattner's rhetoric, was, as opposed to, vowing to work with Democrats across, the spectrum there, he took a much more combative stance to that party, right? Of talking about a party that doesn't fight for working people, that throws working people under the bus, that operates for the billionaires. Plattner was part of this insurgent wing that we've seen have decisive success, at least in the primaries, and we'll see what happens in the midterms. The midterms will be a big test of the staying power of this force in US politics. And that's what made Plattner unpalatable to the Democratic Party. Like, that's what we have to be clear about. This is not about his racist or misogynistic views, the allegations against him. It's the fact that he represents a force in American politics, a force in the United States that is fed up with the Democratic Party, that is fed up with a bipartisan regime that operates very clearly in the interests of the billionaire class. And so it's a little laughable. I mean, it's not funny at all, but that the Democratic Party is painting this as them standing up for women, right? Of believing women, of building off of the gains made in Me Too, a movement which they similarly defanged and similarly watered down all of its most progressive and radical aspects. It's laughable to think that suddenly, after not holding Bill Clinton accountable, not holding anyone within its party accountable for their ties to Epstein and his ring of sex trafficking and abuse, it makes no sense that suddenly now Graham Plattner that was the red line, right? And so I think that a lot of people see through this. I think a lot of people see through the weaponization of our rights, the weaponization of our struggles against patriarchy, oppression, racism, and xenophobia as a political tool for the Democratic Party to try to garner more votes. and to direct the political terrain in their favor. In many ways, like it is just one more example of the way that liberal feminism expressed in the political sphere can't really give any answers to what's happening with Plattner.
And I feel like we should also say that this kind of behavior, sexism, racism, bigotry, absolutely has no place on the left. Like, I think it's also worth reflecting for a moment on how there were a lot of sectors of the left. I mean, Bernie Sanders was one of them, but also a lot of people who would call themselves more explicitly leftists and socialists were still supporting Plattner up until the last second. In fact, are still supporting Plattner right now, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think that as socialists, and as people who are fighting for working people, that means fighting against the things that affect working people, sexism, et cetera, et cetera, even when it's working people who are doing them, right? Who are holding that up because, in a lot of ways, like racism, homophobia, like sexism, all of these things are weaponized to divide working people, right? And so we know, there's been so many op-eds about how, the working class is not a monolith. It has many views, many of them, as we would say, reflecting this kind of bigotry, this kind of very harmful ways that we're oppressed in capitalist society, et cetera, et cetera. Like, but the people who defend Plattner on the basis of, well, he has a really good economic program, and to basically put the other things to the side, swallow your doubts because no one's perfect. I mean, that's just not a viable way of creating the kind of unity we need in the socialist movement. On top of the fact that we want a socialist movement that fights against those things, against exploitation and oppression, against the many ways that we are oppressed under this system. And so I think that a lot of ink was spilled across the pages of Jacobin, The Guardian, Nation, all these places, basically using the arguments against cancel culture, right? That we've gone too far with this Me Too stuff to say that, we have to accept candidates who have marred past if they are fighters today for the working class. And there's an element of truth in that, right? Like the working class is not all on the same page about many of these things. But the problem is that Graham Plattner kind of avoided the questions. He never really took accountability for any of them, right? It was his response to the Nazi tattoo was to say, I didn't know, and then covered it up. His response to the rest of these allegations is to deny them, is to say that, it was to hide them because, of course, we all know that these things come out way before they come out to the public in the public sphere, right? And it was not to own and then to speak very harshly against those things, right? To say that we can change, seeing that the working class is as diverse as it is, suffers many different kinds of oppression as it does, and that we need to overcome those divisions to fight better against the capitalist class. It was kind of just like asking people to swallow a very difficult pill in the interest of either flipping a Republican seat to a Democratic seat, or on the other hand, strengthening the progressive wave in Congress. This speaks to a version of socialism that, we might call class reductionist, right? That says really the only contradiction that we need to focus on is against a capitalist class, is the billionaire class that has too much money and too much power, and that's what we need to concentrate on, as opposed to thinking about the actual class that we represent, the working class, and what does it mean to empower the working class? What does it mean to make a more democratic society that is run by the working class and that takes into account all of the various ways that capitalism oppresses us?
Obviously, we don't want to be like super simplistic here and say that socialism would just solve everything. But we would argue that the alternative to liberal feminism is socialist feminism. And so, as a way of kind of starting to wrap up a little bit here, I want to ask, how does socialist feminism differ from liberal feminism? And more importantly, what would a socialist feminist response to the Epstein scandal look like? What would a socialist feminist response also to the Graham Plattner scandal look like?
Liberal feminism takes for granted that there is a capitalist class and a working class. It takes as its starting point that we operate within a capitalist system where there are people who own what we need to survive, who own what we need to produce what we need to survive, and there are people who have to sell their labor to have access to that. And socialist feminism, on the other hand, says that this central contradiction, this way that society is divided, is the source of exploitation that's the cause of suffering, death, all of the ills of our society, on the one hand, and on the other hand, exacerbates a whole host of other social problems. Exploitation and oppression are twin pillars that hold up this system. And so socialist feminism says that we have to attack those things at the root in order to try to create the conditions for a different kind of society. And that in a different kind of society where we're not forced to sell our labor power or compete with each other for the finite amount of resources that we have, where those resources are distributed according to need, that without that sort of scarcity, the divisions that are created and exacerbated in capitalist society, they can't flourish, right? Those conditions are set for a different kind of society. And as you said, like, that doesn't mean that without capitalism we don't have sexism, racism, but what it does mean is that the structural conditions for those are eliminated. And so therefore we can address them better in that kind of society. And it doesn't mean waiting until we don't have capitalism anymore to do that, right? Like, that's a huge part of what we were talking about even in the Plotner example, is that fighting against those things in the here and now is part of the fight against capitalism, is part of the fight of unifying our ranks to overcome this system. But basically, socialist feminism takes up the idea that our feminism has to be anti-capitalist. We are united by our class, not by our gender. There are women in the capitalist class who are exploiting women workers, right, who make their fortunes off of exploiting a feminized workforce, for example. So fighting against the sort of patriarchy in general requires that kind of class consciousness. Addressing the huge issue that is patriarchy means addressing this other huge issue that is capitalism. And with that, all of the social ills that capitalism creates. So, there is no socialist feminism that doesn't fight against racism, against xenophobia, for the full rights for immigrants, against the vicious trans attacks. I mean, we hardly got into that at all, but that's another thing that has completely robbed liberal feminism of any kind of moral authority, is the fact that it's so willing to throw trans people under the bus and to create a feminism that excludes, in many ways, trans people from its ranks. And it's to say that anything that affects our class and our ability to thrive, even as humans, right, is something that we have to fight together. And so in that way, socialist feminism upends this paradigm of just trying to get more rights in a capitalist society, but rather to create the kind of society where oppression, bigotry can't flourish.
I think that's a really powerful place to end it. Maddie, thank you for coming back to the podcast.
Thanks, Odin. Hope to see you again soon.